The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
Given we tend to default to defensiveness when encountering unfamiliar or uncomfortable ideas, pushing harder in our persuasive efforts will invariably backfire. Influencing others must always start with intentional efforts to disarm rather than provoke.
Good morning, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Kavanagh. This is the Next Big Idea Daily, and it's Monday. So I don't know what you've got going on this week, but I'm going to bet that sometime during the week, you're going to have to persuade someone of something. Whether it's your boss, your kids, your roommate, your coworker, you often want to get other people to change their minds, and it's always an uphill battle. So how do you do it? Well, there is an art and a science, and here with some insight on that is Michael McQueen, author of the new book, Mind Stuck, Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. Michael is an award-winning speaker, business strategist, and trend forecaster, and the author of 5 best-selling books. Here he is to share his big ideas.
We're told that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But what if you could? Having spent the past 2 decades helping leaders and organizations embrace the changes they'd rather fight or ignore, I'd suggest that changing the minds of even the most stubborn individuals is possible, but the process of doing so is very different from what conventional wisdom would suggest. While stubbornness is nothing new, we live in an era where it is more prevalent than ever. You could almost describe obstinance as one of the hallmarks of our age. And yet, changing people's minds is something we spend a lot of our lives trying to do. In fact, we spend 40% of our time attempting to sway the decisions and thinking of others. But despite this, our persuasive efforts are only successful between 3 to 5% of the time. One of the reasons for this is that we're often using 19th and 20th century tactics for changing 21st century minds. It's a dynamic I like to call the Francis Bacon effect. Now, if you're not overly familiar with this name, Francis Bacon was a 17th century scientist and philosopher who's often described as one of the founding fathers of the Enlightenment. Francis Bacon's big idea was that humans are fundamentally rational and reasonable. And as such, he suggested that in order to educate or influence someone to change their thinking, the key was to expose them to reliable evidence and logical arguments. He theorized that if someone was given enough evidence and rational information, they'd have no option but to come to their senses, to see reason, and to change their mind. In recent years, not only have we discovered that this isn't the case, but in fact that the very opposite is true. Exposing people to even the most reliable evidence and logical arguments tends to cause their minds to clamp down rather than open up. The latest discoveries in brain science offer clues as to why this is the case. It's worth clarifying that we can be reasonable and rational, but only part of our brain does this well. This is something I describe as the inquiring mind, and it lives in the frontal lobe of our brains. The inquiring mind loves logic and is both meticulous and nuanced. However, it is slow and takes a lot of energy to use, and so we use it far less than you might assume. In fact, our inquiring mind is responsible for only about 5 to 10% of our perceptions and judgments. The rest of our thinking happens in a very different part of our brains, something I refer to as the instinctive mind. Our instinctive mind is impulsive, it's efficient, and it's governed by the parts of our brain associated with the limbic system. This is one of the most ancient parts of our cognitive hardware, and it's typically associated with tribalism, the processing of emotion, and our flight and fight reflexes. One of the things our limbic system does best is protect us. From a survival perspective, our instincts have served humanity well for thousands of years. The problem is that our instinctive minds react in much the same way whether a threat is physical or psychological. The latest brain research has revealed that when we are confronted with information or ideas that threaten our opinions and convictions, our neurological instinct is to batten down the hatches and retreat to stubbornness. When this happens, even the best evidence and logic will struggle to get a fair hearing. Given we tend to default to defensiveness when encountering unfamiliar or uncomfortable ideas, pushing harder in our persuasive efforts will invariably backfire. Influencing others must always start with intentional efforts to disarm rather than provoke. It goes without saying that humans don't respond well to coercion, and because of this, we need to ensure that our efforts to persuade others don't rob them of their sense of control. The best way to do this is to ensure that people feel they have a choice. Civic engagement expert Peter Block said it best. He said, "The yes of another person means nothing if they don't have the ability to say no. There can be no commitment if there is no choice." End quote. One way to affirm people's autonomy without giving them free rein is to use the technique of guided choices. This is an approach many parents use with their children, but it is equally effective in any leadership context. In the same way that a parent may give their child an option over the order in which they do their chores, for instance, we can give others choices that allow them to feel a sense of agency. After all, people are much more likely to follow through with something if they feel they had some degree of control over the process. Beyond guiding people's choices, another powerful technique for affirming autonomy is to give others the option to do nothing. One simple way you can do this when requesting something of another individual is to use these 15 words after making your appeal. "If you can't do it, I'll completely understand." Then, after a brief pause, you continue, "If you can, I'd really appreciate it." Of course, there are plenty of variations to this approach that use slightly more or fewer words than 15, with phrases like, "Please don't feel obligated," or "This is totally up to you," but the principle remains the same. The reason this works is that it positions the request as one that affirms the other individual's autonomy. They retain the power to choose. It also highlights what the most helpful and generous choice they could make might be, which is a choice the other individual is more likely to make if they feel in control. Either way, giving people an out almost guarantees they'll opt in. While approaches like these can be particularly effective when motivating others to change their actions or behaviour, the same principle applies when we're attempting to influence people's beliefs and opinions. Coercive kinds of persuasion are less obvious here, but they can often take the form of resorting to fear, shame, or guilt. While playing to negative emotions like these can be highly effective in eliciting a reaction, doing so is counterproductive in the long term, as it usually comes at the cost of genuine affinity and trust. Appealing to higher emotions like hope, altruism, and responsibility not only grants people the freedom to choose, but it encourages them to choose on the basis of a far more positive vision for themselves and their world, which means the change they're making is far more likely to stick. After years studying what builds rapport between individuals, neuroeconomist Paul Zak discovered that the most important factor for building trust is our humanness. Being real, vulnerable, and even fallible results in the release of the hormone oxytocin. This is the neuromechanism humans have unconsciously used for centuries to determine who is safe enough to trust and work with. However, vulnerability tends to be the opposite posture most of us adopt when attempting to persuade, influence, or motivate others. Instead, we generally lead with our best arguments, our most irrefutable evidence. We assume that strength, assertiveness, and a sense of being impregnable will make us most persuasive. Things like doubt and uncertainty are to be concealed at all costs because these are a sign of weakness. The original masters of persuasion had a very different view. Before neuroscience and behavioral economics had studied it, the ancients realized that vulnerability was the essential foundation for building affinity and trust. Roman rhetorician Quintilian knew this. For him, one of the most persuasive things any individual could do was to not just acknowledge their uncertainties and doubts, but to lead with them. This idea became known as dubitatio, from which we derive the modern English word dubious. Numerous studies in recent years have confirmed just how effective self-doubt and self-disclosure are in the process of winning people over to us and our ideas. For instance, a meta-analysis by social psychologist Kip Williams found that jurors were more likely to view an attorney and their case more favourably if the attorney revealed weaknesses in their case before the opposition had the chance to do so. In doing this, the attorney signalled that they were fair-minded, balanced, and honest. In fact, verdicts were statistically more likely to be given in favour of the party first to bring up a shortcoming in their argument. While it's only human to want to present ourselves and our ideas in the best light, doing so is both unproductive and unpersuasive. In order to build trust and affinity with those we're seeking to influence, it is vulnerability, self-doubt, and self-disclosure that are more likely to shift the dial.
All right, well, I'm not sure how good I am at the art of persuasion, but let me see what I can do because I want to persuade you right now to become a member of the Next Big Idea Club. No pressure, just take a look at our website. You'll see everything we have to offer: a hardback subscription club, an app, live events, video and audio masterclasses. It's all there at nextbigideaclub.com. And if you like what you see, you can sign up for a free trial, people. And if you really like it, you can use the code DAILY for a special discount. That's nextbigideaclub.com and use the code DAILY. I'm Michael Kovnat. I'll see you tomorrow.